Hello, I'm Vivian Ni. For our debut episode, I had the privilege of speaking with Bill Porter in Barcelona. Also known as Red Pine, Bill is one of the most renowned translators of Chinese Buddhist texts. We discussed his journey from growing up in a wealthy but conventional American family to living a monk's life in Taiwanese monasteries, and his remarkable adventure seeking out hermits in the remote mountains of China. He shared his insights on meditation, translation, and the deep cultural significance of these hermits in Chinese spirituality. Thank you for joining us on this exciting journey into the heart of Chinese culture and literature. Now, let's dive into my conversation with Bill Porter. Hi, Bill. Very pleased meeting you today. So I guess my first question is, where did the pen name Red Pine come from?
You know, when I came to Taiwan, the purpose was to live in a monastery. But I'd studied and I'd taken the Buddhist refuge with a Chinese monk in Chinatown in New York City, and he gave me the name Shengyun, victorious cloud. And so when I lived in Taiwan in the monastery, I had the name Victorious Cloud. But after 3 or 4 years, I moved out of the monastery and living in the community. And I needed a different name, you know, a name that fit with the people I was living with. Because if you're living in Chinese society as a regular person, you can't have the name Shengyun, Victorious Cloud. It's too weird. With a name like that, you belong in a monastery. So I wanted a new name. And I was teaching English 3 nights a week. So I was living on a mountain, coming down every night to teach English from 6 o'clock till 8 o'clock, 3 nights a week. And one night the bus stopped right next to a big advertisement for Hei Song Qi Shui, Black Pine Cola. And I said to myself, that's the name. I like that pine thing. But black, that's the Japanese color. And in fact, Hei Song Qi Shui, the company, was founded by Japanese when Taiwan was controlled by Japan. I said, black is the Japanese color, red is the Chinese color. So I will use the name Red Pine, I decided. So that's when I decided using the name Red Pine. I forgot what year that would have been. It would have been probably, let's see, around 77 maybe, something like that. And about 6 months later, I was doing some research, and I discovered the first great Taoist in Chinese history was Zhongnan, Master Red Pine. So I said, wow, it's a real name. It's a powerful name. So I will use that name. I will keep using that name because when I translate, something powerful happens. You become a conduit. Like Master Red Pine was a shaman. And a translator too is like a shaman. You're really trying to access something without your own personality getting in the way. You're trying to access something in another language. So that's where the name came from. An advertisement for Black Pine Cola. But I just I got rid of the cola and changed the color. And then I discovered it's a powerful name in Chinese history, prehistory. And so I've used it ever since for when I translate. When I write books too, I use Bill Porter when I write a book as a prose book, a travel book. But when I translate Red Pine, I feel like I need to make that statement, and also to myself and to my readers, that this is somebody else. I'm a fictitious person. A translator is fictitious. Translators don't really exist. Their personality fades, and their personality is not so strong. When your personality is strong, you have this ego problem as a translator. You are going to translate in a way that is too personal. You're going to get things wrong. rather than being open to this source text that you're trying to work on. So I've been red pine for quite a while, but when I was working on the translation of the Diamond Sutra, my publisher called me up and said, "Bill, I've been talking to our people in charge of marketing, and they say, if you keep using this name Red Pine, we're not going to sell so many books. It sounds like too weird, too new, like New Age, things like that. I think we need to use your regular name." So, well, I want to sell books too. So this publisher had been introduced to me by the famous American poet named Gary Snyder, member of the Beat Generation, famous as a friend of Jack Kerouac. And Gary had introduced me to his publisher. And so when his publisher said, "I think we got to get rid of Red Pine," I said, "Okay." But then 2 weeks later, he called me up and he said, "Bill, I've talked to Gary. You're Red Pine." So ever since then, I've been Red Pine when I translate. And I'm glad I could keep that name, because I would have gotten rid of it to sell more books. But in fact, I like to use a name like that because it reminds me, and reminds, I think, my readers that this is a different kind of author or translator. I'm not your regular person. I'm like a shaman. I just happen to be experiencing this text and passing it on to you. It's passing through me to you.
Can you tell me about your childhood?
It was certainly, when you're a child, you don't think of your life being any different from anybody's. But when I grew up, there were always fences around our property, big fences, to keep people out. And then later, when my parents started sending me to boarding school, I realized we came from a wealthy family. I would think it's not a good experience to be from a wealthy family, because what parents do when they have a lot of money, they have to spend a lot of time spending that money. And having children is really a problem, because it's hard to take care of your children. Of course, you can hire people to do that, but the easier solution is to send your children away to school. And so you live at what they call boarding schools. And so when I grew up, I spent most of my childhood in boarding schools with strangers, people I didn't know. And it was a painful experience. I can still remember that sense of being not at home and wondering, when are my parents going to come pick me up and take me home? And for years that was sort of a painful reminder. But on the bright side, I'm always looking at the bright side. On the bright side, it gave me the ability to be alone and to find strength in being alone, and even cultivating being alone. And so that was my childhood, learning to be alone. And of course, then there was the other situation was the money, because there was so much money when I grew up. I always thought my father was about to be arrested any day, because surely he's counterfeiting money. I never saw him do any work, and yet he had all this money. Where's it coming from? I thought he must have a printing press somewhere where he prints the money. But of course, he was just a businessman, and he owned all these hotels. He operated a chain of hotels, 52 hotels. It was the second largest chain of hotels in America, behind Hilton. Hilton had more hotels than my father. Anyway, that's how I grew up, in a very wealthy family, and also a very powerful father. He wanted to be president, sort of like Trump. My father was a sort of an early version of that, somebody who really has no business thinking that they could be president, but in America you can do that. My father actually thought about being president, and he actually decided to run for governor of Arizona once. And then we moved to Arizona so he could establish residency. But then, and he had this huge fundraising banquet, and then shortly after that, he withdrew his name. And I never really understood why he went to that trouble and then didn't do it. Little did I know the reason why he had done that is because he was a bank robber. Well, I didn't know that until much later in life. After he died, his sister, my Aunt Pearline, said, "There's something about your father you should know." When my father was 17, he and his cousins, they grew up on a cotton farm in Arkansas, picking cotton. Very painful. Your fingers get hurt from all the cotton, the little spines on the cotton ball that hold the cotton ball in place. So they decided just to rob banks. They formed a gang and started robbing banks. And they must have robbed, I don't know, a dozen, or who knows how many banks. Nobody knows, because that information was died with the gang. Anyway, one day they ended up, they started working their way up the Mississippi, and one day they were in Detroit. They had planned to rob a bank. And the police apparently found out about what bank they were going to rob and were waiting for them, and they killed everybody, except the getaway driver got away, and my father had his knee shot out from under him, so he couldn't run. So he was imprisoned. The prison sentence was for 25 years, but he only spent 6 years in prison, and he got out. And then when his mother, when he was put in prison, his mother sold the cotton farm so they could move from Arkansas to Detroit. And she and her two daughters, Pearline and Pauline, would visit my father in prison. And so when he got out of prison, his mother divided all the money among her daughters and my father. He got 1/3 of the money from the sale of the cotton farm. And so he went down to El Paso, Texas, and that's where the getaway driver, his cousin Neil, was hiding. And so Neil was operating a hotel in El Paso, and he taught my father how hotels operate. And my father used his money to take out a lease on another hotel in Texas and several others. And then suddenly he had hotels. When I was born in 43, he operated 52 hotels. He had hotels in every state in America, in every west of the Mississippi, in the western half of America. So he became a wealthy man, a man without any education, really. He never finished high school, but he learned how to operate a business and became very successful at it, but he had aspirations to be more than that, just like Trump. My father wanted really to be president, and he would actually do this. He would sit me and my brother down on a sofa about once a year, and he would say, "Boys, there's something I want you to know." He says, "I can't do it, but I want you to do this. I want one of you boys to be president." He would say this to us, and he was serious about it. It was always very embarrassing when he would say this, because we were kids. What the hell? Being president? You got to be kidding me. Of course, he was drinking, and that explained it, so we always thought this is all just crazy talk. But for him, it was serious. He really wanted to do that, but he never did. And then he drank a lot. He would beat our mother about once every year, at least once a year, maybe twice a year. And because we were away in school a lot, how many times we don't know. So finally, she got tired of getting beat up and divorced him. And divorces only take a couple of months, but it took 14 years for the courts to decide who owned what, because he had property in 11 different states. And so by the time all of the divorce settlement concerning property was done, there was no money left. He had no more money. Also, my mother had no money. So, as they say, the lawyers got it all. and actually, a couple of judges got it all, too. shared in the spoils of a divorce case. And I was relieved personally because my father wanted his sons to take over this hotel business and have all this money. And as a child, when you're a child, you can see things adults can't see. And what children see better than adults is what's in a person's heart. And so all these people would come around my parents. They had bad hearts. Bad hearts. They wanted to access my father's power connections, his political connections, or money. And so as a child, I always worried that someday I would have to inherit this. And it felt terrible, the idea of all this money. So when he lost all his money, I was very relieved because I was free of this. I felt very sorry for him because money was everything. But for me, it was freedom. No more, I don't have to worry about that. I can make my own life. And I didn't know how I was going to do that, but things have worked out. You go one day at a time, one decision at a time, and that was my childhood, basically, trying to get free of money.
It seems that you were able to see through the wealth that your family had at a young age and instead saw it as a source of suffering, similar in some ways to the story of the Buddha. Do you feel that was some sort of early insight?
Well, looking back at it now, I would say yes. It was karma, my karmic past, providing me with the ability to see things that way. Because my brother and sister didn't see things that way. They were so sad when we lost our money. They loved the money and being able to buy things with the money. But for me, it was a great relief. So yeah, I'd say I was benefited in ways that most people weren't, in being able to not only see that, but to reject it, and to want to find something else. So I was always open to sort of a spiritual path. I remember even when we'd go to church, I took Christianity seriously. I thought what Christ had done and his teaching of universal love, of brotherhood of human beings, all being the children of God, and we all should treat each other. I thought that was a great teaching, and wanted to somehow follow on that path. But his teaching wasn't, Christianity's teaching wasn't just about the teaching of love. It was also obedience to God and belief in this thing called God. I could never accept that. And so Christianity turned out to be a path that was a dead end for me. Eventually Buddhism wasn't. So anyway, it was, we all get, in our childhood, we're prepared for our future in ways that we have no idea. And I gained the ability to see through wealth and money, and also the appreciation of being alone. I didn't realize the pain of being alone as a child actually turned out to be a blessing when I wanted to cultivate meditation and being free of the cultural delusions that we all think is what constitutes reality. We always think that everything is real in our culture. Like, there was once this great Tibetan yogi named Milarepa, and once one of his disciples said, "Master, well, what's the easiest way? What's the quickest way? I want to be enlightened. What's the quickest way to be enlightened?" And Milarepa said, "Leave your country." We don't realize that the society, the culture we live in, is simply a system of delusions, a system of ways of looking at things. And a way of looking at things is just a set of arbitrary distinctions. That one group decides, this is good, that's bad, this is black, that's white. And these are the rules, and these are the right rules. And so we grow up in cultures that create prisons for us. It's hard to see out of that prison. The Milarepa was saying, leave your country, get out of your prison, and you might have a chance to break through these cultural barriers. And we still have to live in a culture, but being able to realize that you can look at the culture you live in as a delusion and still live in it. So that was key for me, being able to achieve that sort of realization through meditation and of course running into Buddhism, because this is the basic teaching of Buddhism, is the emptiness of distinctions.
So when and where did you first encounter Buddhism?
The first time I experienced this was at a German university. After I was in the Army, I went back to America and studied anthropology at the University of California in Santa Barbara. And they had a program where you could for your junior year, you could go to a foreign country. And I happened to go to Germany for my year abroad, because I had been in the Army in Germany and I liked Germany. So I went back there for a year of college at the University of Göttingen in northern Germany, near the city of Hanover. And I took a year-long course in statistics. And during the second semester, we were doing correlation coefficients, how you establish the relationship between different entities. What you're trying to do is write a formula for establishing a perfect correlation between two variables. So you have you have an x-axis and a y-axis. And so you want to create a perfect correlation so a movement on one axis is met by a corresponding movement on the other axis, on x and y. So you're trying to write a formula that adjusts that over time to create a perfect correlation of one. And it occurred to me one day that to the extent that you can actually do that, you have just proven to yourself that you were mistaken when you divided x from y. And that was this incredible insight I had it's basically the underlying realization of the Buddha. It's the doctrine of emptiness, of non-duality. But I didn't know what to do with that. It was just, I said, this is an incredible idea. And so then I began reading texts by these German and Austrian phenomenologists who were philosophers who had ideas about this. And the next year I was graduating from Santa Barbara, I happened to read this book by Alan Watts called The Way of Zen. And so there it was. And the doctrine of Zen was this idea, there's no X, there's no Y. It's not that there's not anything, there's no distinctions that are real. All X's and all Y's are artificial. And of course we live our lives with them, but we don't live our lives thinking they're artificial. We just think that's the way they are. So that's sort of when I began gaining the appreciation for the basic doctrines of Buddhism. First, simply by studying statistics in Germany. And then by reading a book by Alan Watts saying, oh, this teaching of Zen is the same thing. And then meeting a monk in Chinatown who lived that life. So I was just thinking of it in terms of ideas. And suddenly here we have somebody who's living that life. And then, so that's when I met somebody who manifested that in their daily life, led me to say, this is what I want to do. And so I quit this PhD program at Columbia. I went to live in a monastery in Taiwan. That's the background to my getting involved in the Buddhist path.
Where was the first place you stayed in Taiwan?
Well, one of my fellow classmates at Columbia was a German fellow who had spent a few weeks in Taiwan. For a graduation trip, his father gave him a trip around the world, and he'd stopped in Thailand, India, and Thailand, and he also stopped in Taiwan. You couldn't go to China then. It was the Cultural Revolution. So he stopped in Taiwan, and he happened to go to this monastery that he heard about called Foguangshan, and he met somebody there. So he told me, I went to this university, this monastery in Taiwan. You could go there. And I met this girl there, and here's her address. And so I wrote to the monastery, and the monastery said, oh, you're welcome, of course you can come. And then I wrote to the girl, because for a Westerner to go to Taiwan in those days and live in Taiwan, you had to have a sponsor, somebody who would agree to vouch for you being a good person. And so she became my sponsor, and I went to Taiwan, live in the monastery in Foguangshan. They welcomed me there, and I had no idea what it was going to be like, but I knew this was a path I had to go on. That was 1972, September of 72. And I stayed at Foguangshan until around June of the following year. And well, Foguangshan was a wonderful experience, but it was a Pure Land monastery. The practice was mainly chanting and prostrations. Chanting and prostrations, Pure Land Buddhism. Well, chanting the name of the Buddha so you can be reborn in paradise. And that was a bit weird for me. I hadn't read about Pure Land Buddhism. It was a bit different. I thought I've been in Chinese type monastery. There must be Zen around here, right? He said, no Zen here. So after 9 months, I went back to Taipei, to northern Taiwan, and my sponsor said, I know you like living in a monastery, but you really need to have your Chinese improve, because you're not going to learn any Chinese living in a monastery. You don't speak. So I agreed, and I went to the College of Chinese Culture, where she was in charge of the museum there. And so I took some classes in philosophy, and my Chinese improved. But I still, after the semester, I said, that's enough. I came to Taiwan to get away from college. I don't need more knowledge. So then she arranged for me to live in this Zen monastery. It was the abbot was the head of the Zen sect in Taiwan. He was the chief Rinzai Zen monk in Taiwan, Master Wu Ming. Wu is Kai Wu de Wu, Guangming de Ming, enlightened light, light of enlightenment. He was also the head of the Buddhist Association, the most powerful monk in Taiwan at the time. In fact, when I moved into the monastery, every couple of months they would lock us in our rooms. Everybody in the monastery would get locked in a room because Chiang Kai-shek would come, because Wu Ming was his master, and he would come to see Wu Ming, and then go back to Taipei, and they let us out of our rooms. So it was a wonderful experience in that monastery, because there were no tourists. At Foguangshan, there were tourists all the time coming, and they would look, they'd be staring at me, especially because I was a foreigner. They'd never seen a foreigner before, so I felt very uncomfortable being stared at all the time. It's hard to feel it natural. But this other monastery, Haimingse, was a perfect monastery for me. Because I could do anything I wanted. The abbot, the day I came, he picked up a stick, and he hit the stick on a rock. And he said, "Can you hear that?" "Yeah." He said, "Well, that means it's time to eat. If you have any questions, just ask." That was it. And then they gave me a room, and I lived in this wonderful. I had my own little room. It was a room where lay people can live. And it was in the mountains, and so I could walk around the mountains every day. And there was a bathtub, not in my room, but in 2 floors down. There was a bathtub. I could take a bath. It was just cold water. You poured cold water over. It was Taiwan, so it's the Tropic of Cancer. So you didn't really. And once a week we got a bucket of hot water. They had a boiler where they would heat up enough water so everybody got a bucket. So you could sort of give yourself a hot water sponge bath and pour a little bit of hot water over you. So that was a wonderful experience for me also, in the sense that all the food was vegetarian. And I'd never had a diet of vegetables before. because they use so much tofu, bean curd, and wheat gluten, they could make things that taste better than meat, actually. And so it was a great diet for me. And I lived there for over 2 years until one day the abbot called me into his office, and he said, "We just got a phone call from the U.S. consulate. Your father died." And so I hadn't heard from my father for years. He never wrote me. But a week later, I got a letter from him. And it just had 2 lines in it. You've been over there 3 or 4 years now. Isn't it time you did something productive with your life? Dad. That was the letter. And so I thought about that because I've been living this blissful life in the monastery. They didn't ask any money of me. I could do whatever I want to do. I meditated a lot and I walked in the mountains a lot. Every day afternoon after lunch, I'd walk in the mountains and I would meditate on this grave mound. There was some wealthy person had built a really fancy grave. There was a great mound to meditate on, surrounded by flowers. Wonderful place. So I hated the idea of leaving it, but I realized I had to leave the monastery and go see if there is something productive I could do with my life. So again, my sponsor, Annie Chen, she said, "Well, if you want to leave the monastery, one of our neighbors has a farmhouse in the mountains, and I'm sure he'd rent it to you." And so that's what I did. I moved into this farmhouse, converted farmhouse on the mountain outside of Taipei. There's a mountain called Yangmingshan, but beyond Yangmingshan, there's another mountain called Qishingshan, 7-star mountain. And so there's a farming village called Bamboo Lake. There's no lake. The Japanese drained the lake when they took over Taiwan, 100 years earlier. But there was all these cabbage farmers, cabbages and calla lilies. And so I lived there for 14 years in this farmhouse. And then I started working. Before I left the monastery, the abbot had given me Cold Mountains poems. He said he had financed this book of Cold Mountains poems. And I'd heard of Cold Mountain because he was a hero of the Beat Generation. Jack Kerouac's book, Dharma Bums, was dedicated to Han Shan, or Cold Mountain. So I said, I've heard about him, but I had no idea you had his poems. So the abbot gave me Cold Mountain's poems. And so when I left the monastery, I took them with me and I started translating them. And Cold Mountain was distinctive in the history of Chinese poetry. He's the first poet of any significance who wrote in the vernacular, common speech, ordinary speech. So his poems were really simple. And they had to be for me to understand them because my Chinese wasn't very good. But I could understand Cold Mountain's poems because they were about the Dharma. And they used vernacular expressions, vernacular style, very simple sentence structure, very easy. And so I started translating them and got to the point where I tried to publish them, and I got letters of rejection by several publishers. And then somebody asked me, well, you've got all these books by this man named John Blofeld. Why don't you ask him what to do? And I wrote to John Blofeld in care of his publisher, which I thought was a weird idea. How can you write to an author? They're living in another world. But John wrote me back and asked me to send me some of your translations. Send me 10. And I did. And I got those translations back, covered with notes. He said, send me 10 more. And in the course of the next year, I ended up going through all the poems of Cold Mountain. I had never planned to translate more than 100 poems. But Cold Mountain left 300 poems. I thought, that's a mountain. How can I climb that mountain? But John kept encouraging me to keep translating, and I ended up translating all those poems. And then, in those days, very few Westerners were in Taiwan who were not associated with the Vietnam War. That is, there were very few Westerners who came to Taiwan to study Chinese culture. But one day, so every weekend there would be a party. Westerners would have parties at different people's houses. So eventually you'd hear about everybody else and what they're doing in Taiwan. So one day somebody knocked on my door. They came up the mountain and found my house and knocked on my door, and they said, "I hear you're translating Cold Mountain. Do you need a publisher?" I said, "Are you kidding?" This man's name was Michael O'Connor, and he said, I know a publisher. They love your poetry. So I sent my poetry to this press called Copper Canyon Press in Port Townsend, Washington, because he was from that area. And the owner of the press was a big fan of Cold Mountain. He was affiliated with this beatnik generation and some of the poets in it. He said, "I love to publish your work." And so he published my book of Cold Mountain. I realized, wow, I can actually give this to somebody and it can be printed and shared with other people. So I thought when I was translating Cold Mountain, I got another edition, an earlier edition of Cold Mountain's poems. And after Cold Mountain's poems, there were poems by a Buddhist monk named Stonehouse. And they were even better than Cold Mountain's. And so I translated those too and published those through. Mike O'Connor had friends who had another press called Empty Bowl. And so I published my book on Stonehouse with Empty Bowl. And then I translated the works of Bodhidharma and published them with Empty Bowl. So I started, without even thinking about it, I became a translator and started publishing these translations. And once you publish something, it's out of your hands, and then you have an opportunity to translate something else. So I've been translating and publishing translations of Chinese poetry and Buddhist texts ever since then.
It seems that you encountered both Pure Land and Zen teachings in Taiwan. Which one was it easier for you to accept? And which one do you think is easier for the general Chinese public?
Yeah, well, the one that's easier for me is Zen, the Chan school of Zen, because it's based on meditation and work. I should say it's based on meditation and your daily life. This is how Zen developed in China, and very few people realize this. But you know, when Bodhidharma came to China, he had a few disciples, and when his successor Hui Ke, the second patriarch, taught, he also had a few disciples. And the third patriarch, Sun Can, had one disciple. We only know of one disciple the third patriarch had. But his disciple, that one disciple, Dao Xin, he had 500. And so what happened when the fourth patriarch received the Dharma? How did he end up with 500 disciples? Because all these previous transmitters of Zen didn't have their own monastery. They lived sometimes in the mountains, in a cave like Bodhidharma, or sometimes in somebody else's monastery like the third patriarch, Sun Can. He lived in another monastery. But the fourth patriarch created an agricultural commune. He got some land in the mountains in what we call, in English, a mountain basin. Not on a mountain slope or on a mountain top or the foot of the mountain, but in a place in the mountains that forms a basin. And so what he did is he created an agricultural commune. And the reason why this is so important for the development of Zen is because previous to this, Buddhists were forbidden to farm and were also required to beg for a living. And this is the first time Buddhists worked for a living, and the reason they weren't able to farm is because when you farm, you're going to kill some bugs, some worms. And so Dao Xin said, we're going to farm. And what this did is it freed the group, the community. It made the community self-supporting, freed them from the need to beg. And it also, this was the beginning of vegetarianism in China. Buddhists, there is no rule in Buddhism that you have to be a vegetarian. In fact, the Buddha died supposedly by eating some rotten meat. Because when you put your bowl out there, you have to take what people put in it. And often you get meat. So this was the beginning of the practice of vegetarianism in China. And this is the importance of tofu. Before, the tofu had never played a major role in the Chinese diet, although it was begun by a Taoist, Huainanzi. Huainanzi is the Taoist Huainanzi invented supposedly tofu in the 3rd century, and it had been around, but it never played a prominent role until this agricultural commune developed, started by Dao Xin. And his successor, Hongren, had 1,000 disciples. And his successor, the 6th patriarch, had 3,000. So what the key to Zen, the development of Zen in China was the development of the agricultural commune. And the reason this is important is because Zen the word just means meditation. And of course, meditation is important, but so is your daily life. And by living and practicing together, your whole day becomes practice. You don't just practice in your meditation, on your meditation, and then go out in the street and walk around among people who are trying to make money. But you live among hundreds of people who are doing the same thing as you. And so this was the secret to the success of Zen in China, was the development of the agricultural commune. And the reason I know this is because I visited every important Zen monastery of the Tang Dynasty. And almost all of them are in the Gan River or the Xiang River watersheds. And this is where they discovered this agricultural niche called the High Mountain Basin. And every one of these monasteries is a high mountain basin, is built in a high mountain basin, where you can have hundreds and even thousands of disciples, and you're completely cut off from the world, but yet you're not dependent on the world. And they're able to live together as a commune and develop this sense where everything I'm doing is my practice. Before that, Zen is just sitting meditation. Well, suddenly, Zen became working in the fields, Zen. Washing the dishes is Zen. This was the beginning of Zen in China. And that appealed to me more than Pure Land, because Pure Land requires a belief, whereas Zen requires no belief at all. It's all up to you. It's your own practice is your whole universe. Whereas in Pure Land, there's always something beyond you. There's the vow of Amitabha to create this paradise for you to come to be reborn in. But once you're reborn there, you're still going to have to go through that rebirth before you can become enlightened. So for me, the Pure Land Buddhism is more like Christianity, because it is based upon a belief of that which you cannot see. Whereas Zen Buddhism is based upon emptiness, on nothing, on non-duality. I always wondered at Foguangshan, they have a big gate there called Buerman, the gate of non-duality. I remember my first week there, I asked, the monk was showing me this, gate of non-duality, and I said, well, why don't you just say the gate of oneness instead of non-duality? He said, oh, no, we can't do that. Because if you say the gate of oneness, there's always the not one. And then you have duality again. So that's sort of the underlying teaching of Zen is just the realization of non-duality. Again, X and Y. X and Y are arbitrary distinctions. There is no X and Y, unless you want there to be one. And so Zen, this is the core message of Zen. It was my first insight into transcendent understanding. was my X and Y experience. And I found a home for that in Zen. I didn't find a home for it in Pure Land Buddhism.
You spent a while in monasteries, but why didn't you become a monk?
Well, I probably would have become a monk, but two reasons. First, I have a hard time with authority. I've never liked authority. I had a hard time in the army. I was court-martialed several times because I refused to obey orders. Because the people giving you orders, you always think, that person is so stupid, and yet they're telling me what to do. So I've never been able to do that. And when I started going to boarding schools, my first school was a military school with all these people giving me orders. I'm a child, and they're telling me what to do. So I developed a certain resistance to authority because I wasn't interested in obeying somebody, and especially when I was attracted to Buddhism. Buddhism was not about obeying somebody; it's getting rid of higher and lower, getting rid of dualities. So I never saw the sense in becoming a monk and having to obey somebody else. I never really could do that. There's a personal basis. And between these two monasteries, I spent this semester going to this college, Wenhua Xueyuan, Chinese Culture College. I think it's a university now, but it's called the Chinese Culture College. And I was taking this course in philosophy taught by Xie Youwei, a professor named Xie Youwei. And Xie Youwei had studied with Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead at Harvard. And so every semester he taught either Bertrand Russell or Whitehead. And I was there for the Whitehead semester. And so I was studying in Chinese. I was studying the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead. And this girl sat behind me. And we fell in love. So why didn't I become a monk? Because I can't handle authority and because I fell in love. What can I do?
That's very nice reasons.
Yeah. And yeah. So even when I moved to the second monastery, Haimingse, every Saturday I would get I would hike down the mountain about 30 minutes to the local train station in Shulin, and then I would take the local train about 30 minutes to Taipei, and I'd get off and I'd walk about 3 or 4 blocks to Mingxin Cafe Dian, the Astoria coffee shop. It was the most famous coffee shop in Taipei. It was the only coffee shop in Taipei. It was started by Zhang Jinghuo's Russian wife, because when she and her husband came to Taiwan in '49, she had all these Russian friends who came with her, part of her entourage, you might say. And so they needed a coffee shop, and so she started this coffee shop, and all the poets and intellectuals hung out at the Mingxin Cafe Dian, the Astoria. And so, there was always this man, a poet named Zhou Mengjie, used to sell private. People would pay to publish their own poetry, and Zhou Mengjie would sell people's poetry in front of the Cafe Dian. And so I would meet my girlfriend every Saturday at the Mingxin Cafe Dian, and we would go up to the 3rd floor where you didn't have to buy anything, and there's just tables and chairs. And then she would help me read the commentary on the Zhuangzi, on the Taoist text by the Ming Dynasty monk Han Shan De Qing. Han Shan De Qing was the greatest Buddhist writer of the Ming Dynasty, and he wrote these beautiful commentaries on the Tao Te Ching and on Zhuangzi. And so this girl, every week she would help me read this commentary, and suddenly I learned how to read classical Chinese. And so this is this woman I'm falling in love with. and seeing every Saturday. So again, it's really hard to stay in a monastery when you're going to the coffee shop and seeing the girl you're falling in love with every Saturday. It's hard to become a monk. And I would have been a bad monk. So it's a good thing I didn't become a monk. I would have been a bad one. I would have broken the precepts.
It's the first time I've met someone who actually knew and met Zhou Mengdi.
He was also a mentor. He would come and talk with me. My girlfriend's older sister was a good friend of Zhou Mengdi, and both she and my girlfriend contributed money. Zhou Mengdi wanted to print a new edition of Cold Mountains poetry from a Qing Dynasty edition, and everybody had to pay $100. And so I have a copy of this Qing Dynasty book that Zhou Mengdi arranged to have reprinted. It has my wife's name in it, and has the names of everybody else who contributed 100 Taibi to have that published. So Zhou Mengdi had a bookshelf, three pieces of wood, and he had wheels on them. And so all the poets in Taiwan in those days would self-publish. There was no really poetry press. But you could get your books published. You could go to a printer and get 100 copies made. So all that Zhou Mengdi did was he lived on the money he made by selling people's poetry on his little bookshelf. And he always wore, his clothing was always nothing but rags, just patched together. You know, a very simple, and he impressed me. To me, that was the ideal of the Chinese scholar, so dedicated to his craft and his art. And he wrote poetry himself, but a very humble man, Zhou Mengdi. Always having fun, making jokes, but thin as a rail. Because he didn't eat very much, and so he always had illnesses later on in life because he didn't get enough nutrition. But a great man, great man. And poetry was really good too, but I think he was a better person than his poetry. I mean, the power of him and his influence as a person was more powerful than the poetry itself. People would see him, and it's like seeing the sage sitting on a bench, selling, in rags, just selling his poetry. People were impressed with him. He impressed a lot of people.
What was your life like at the Bamboo Lake? Was it a hermit-like life?
Sort of. Yeah, I would practice my calligraphy, and I would work on my Coal Mountain poems, and then Stonehouse poems. I was always working on some kind of a thing, and then I did that for about a few years, and then around 82 or so, I got married. I got married in 1980. I got married, and then we had children, and so I had to get a job, and so then I actually started working. I had to get up in the morning at 5 o'clock and go to the radio station. A taxi would come up the mountain just to pick me up, and then take me to the radio station, and they would bring me four newspapers. So I would have all the early editions of all the major four newspapers, and then I would read through the top stories and write all the top 10 stories I had to have ready by 7:30. I had 2 hours to write the top 10 stories based upon the Zhongyang Erbao and Lianhebao, the different newspapers in Taiwan. And then around 9 o'clock in the morning, I would start making phone calls, because when you're writing the stories, it's based on yesterday's news. But there's always as a journalist, you need more information on what's happening now. And so I would always have to call up the government ministries, depending on where the news source was coming from, or I have to call up a literary agent or a movie star's agent to find out about what's going on with the story. A journalist. And then I'd always have to, arrange a new interview. Once a week, I had to have produce a half-an-hour interview with somebody who could speak English. That's how I met people like Wang Wenyang, Winston Wang, who gave me the money to go find hermits. I would meet the most important people in Taiwan, Ma Ying-zhou, people who could speak English for our listeners.
Did that experience help you become a writer?
Not the interview part. That was hard. That was hard because even though they would speak English, you have to edit it. And you know how we edited tape? With a razor blade. With a razor blade, and your fingers you have to cut the tape and then put it together with another piece of tape, and you have to and then you're listening to it, and you have to get rid of the right? Anyway, we figured it takes an hour for every minute. You have to spend an hour of editing for every finished minute when you're doing someone whose native language is not English. It was the hardest part of the job was doing that weekly interview and then editing the tape.
What drove you to go in search of hermits?
Well, because the first people I translated were people who wrote poetry, like Cold Mountain and Stonehouse, and they were hermits. They lived in the mountains. And I wondered, is that real? Do people really live like that? And are there still people? I've always wondered about that. And I couldn't go to China until '87. People from Taiwan were not allowed to go to China in '87. You could sneak through in Hong Kong if you really wanted to. But my wife worked for the Ministry of Communications, in the headquarters of the Ministry of Communications. And so if I would have gone to China, I would have gotten her into trouble. And I didn't go until after '87. I finally said, oh, maybe I could go to China too. And so finally in '89, I decided I applied to the Guggenheim Foundation in America for some money so I can go to China to find hermits. And I'm doing my interviews still, and I was interviewing Winston Wang. His father was the son of Wang Yongqing, the richest man in Taiwan at that time, and Wang Wenyang was in charge of the plastics company, Nanya Plastics, the world's biggest plastics producer at that time. And so at the end of the interview, I asked Winston, did you ever see the movie The Graduate? Where Dustin Hoffman plays the graduate, and during the movie, when he graduates, there's a party, and some wealthy businessman comes up to Dustin and he says, I just have one word of advice for you, son. Plastics. Plastics. That's the future. Plastics. So I asked Winston, did you see the movie The Graduate? Did you see that scene? He says, yeah, I remember that scene. So what would you tell a son, tell a graduate? He said, I would tell them, follow the Tao. And he didn't say plastics, he said, and I was really taken with that comment. And so I said, well, I guess this is something I'm trying to do myself, is following the Tao. And, this might be my last interview, because I've applied to the Guggenheim Foundation to go to China to find hermits, people like Han Shan, to see whether people like that exist. He said, well, gee, if they don't give you the money, I will. And so 2 weeks later, I get the letter from the Guggenheim Foundation saying, sorry, we can't give you the money. So the same day, I call up Winston. I said, Winston, I didn't get the money. He says, how much do you need? I think about $5,000, I think. He said, well, come down this afternoon, and you want it in cash or traveler's checks? So I just went down, he gave me the cash, and then I called up my friend in America who was a photographer, and I said, I have enough money. So he came over to meet me in Hong Kong, and we went off to China to find hermits. I found out where to find hermits the first day I was in China. No, the second day. The second day. The first day I arrived in Beijing was on May Day, 89. This next day, I went to Guangji Si, because that's where the Buddhist Association had its headquarters. And I went in there, and I asked a monk if they knew about that, and this other monk overheard me say that, and that was Jinghui Fa-shi. And he said, I think there's still hermits in the Zhongnan Mountains. So I did hear that from him. But then there was an official standing right next to Jinghui, and he said, no, they're not. There's not any hermits anywhere. But Jinghui shut up. He knew better, because his official was somebody with government power. Jinghui was just Fujiao Xiehui de Fu Huijiang, the deputy director at that time. So actually, I did hear about where hermits were, but I didn't know where the Zhongnan Mountains were. It took me a while to find out where they were. But like when you know Chinese, you don't know if it's singular or plural. So I thought Zhongnan Mountain must be one mountain someplace, and then I go to see it and I find out it's hundreds of miles of Zhongnan Mountains. So I didn't know what to do. So we just went outside on the road, and I waved at this taxi driver. There's a woman taxi driver, and she was dressed in really nice clothes. She was a fashion designer before the Cultural Revolution, I guess, or whatever. And we said, "Would you take us to the Zhongnan Mountains?" That's all. We said, "Take us to the Zhongnan Mountains." And then she took us there, and we said, "Could you come back in 2 days?" And she took us as far as she could, and then we hiked into the mountains. And then within 3 hours, we're sitting with hermits, writing down a hermit address, or they're drawing little maps in the dirt. Oh, there's a hut over here, and there's a hut over there. So once we went to the Zhongnan Mountains, we the first day, within about 3 hours, we were sitting there, and then these monks are telling us, "Oh, there's hermits over here and there's hermits over there." But we didn't know that the Zhongnan Mountains was such a center of hermits. And then I traveled around China and visited half a dozen other mountains, looking for hermits and finding them in some places, especially in Fujian. In Fujian, I found more hermits than I think anywhere else. But anyway, when we came down the mountain on the day after Tiananmen, on June the 5th, we came down Tailao Shan. Everybody was talking about what had just happened at Tiananmen. So we left the country. We went down to Xiamen immediately and took a boat to Hong Kong, because we didn't know what was going to happen in China after that. We waited till August. And then August, we said, okay, let's go back to China now, see what's happening. And we just chose one place, because we thought we can't go all over China, because people will attract attention. We just go to Xi'an, where lots of tourists go, and we'll be tourists. And then we start going into the mountains.
In your book, Roads to Heaven, you wrote a whole chapter about the Kunlun or Zhongnan Mountains. Can you tell me something about that?
Well, the reason you have the name Zhongnan Mountains in China, Zhong means end, the end of something, Nanshan, South Mountains. If you come to China from Pakistan, and where most of the Buddhism and the major Silk Road, as soon as you get to Kashgar, you turn right, and you go to Xi'an, and your entire trip from Kashgar to Xi'an, there are mountains on your right side. You're on the south. So that's the beginning of the Nanshan, really. And the Zhongnanshan is the end of the Nanshan. So really the name Zhongnanshan just refers to those mountains at the very end of all these different beginning with the Kunlun Mountains, the first set of mountains after Pakistan, when you get to Kashgar, you turn right. The first mountains on your right, the Kunlun Mountains. And then you get to Qinghai, to the Gansu province. The names keep changing. And then until finally you get past Lanzhou, and then a little bit past Lanzhou, you get the Zhongnan Mountains beginning around Tianshui. I was amazed by that idea that this is when Taoists and the earliest Taoists talk about the spiritual world, they're always talking about the Kunlun Mountains. So these mountains along the south of you, when you're traveling towards China, are sacred mountains to a lot of different people. And there are these stories, too, about the Kunlun Mountains. There was Mu Wang, King Mu of the Zhou dynasty. Mu Wang, Zhou Mu Wang. Zhou Mu Wang decided to take an army of 50,000 soldiers to Iran. Well, but that was not using the word Iran. He wanted to go visit the Siwang Mu. So he wrote this record of his travels called Mu Tianzizhuan, and people always thought it was a myth. And then they found during of course he wrote this around 1000 AD, BC, maybe 950 BC, something like that. He wrote this record, and people thought it was a myth. And then later, during the Han Dynasty, they found a tomb with his record in it. And so he made this trip, and apparently it was a spiritual trip, and he was trying to find the origins of Chinese culture. The Chinese government doesn't like this idea at all, but apparently the earliest Chinese people always looked toward the West as where they had received their cultural heritage in a way. And one of the great, of course, deities was Siwang Mu, whose kingdom was in northern Afghanistan. And so Mu Tianzi took this trip all the way to K2, to the Kunlun, which is people thought that was K2 in the on the border between Pakistan and China. And then he kept going all the way to Balkh, the ancient city of Balkh, where Siwang Mu lived. And then he kept going, and apparently he was looking for the Garden of Eden. He went to the place where Christians think the original Garden of Eden is just north of Tehran, about 100 kilometers or so, up near this lake, the Caspian Sea. And so his record depicts that journey, and I always wanted to take that trip, follow his footsteps. There was a professor at Huagang who has a 3-volume study of the actual journey of Mu Tianzizhuan using satellite photos and trying to correspond to his actual trip based upon his journey. His journey is just how many days I would go north how many days, south how many days. And so you can figure out his actual journey. And so these mountains, the Kunlun Mountains, sort of for these early Taoists and people like King Mu, represented it's like an origin story, and paying respects. And there also there's stories about King Huangdi. Huangdi once sent his minister to Kunlun to pay respects. And why would Huangdi send his minister to Kunlun to pay respects, unless that meant something? So I always thought that there was early Chinese culture always looked toward the West as some kind of a mother lode, the mother source of certain elements of Chinese culture. Anyway, so I always was interested in that myself. So when I wrote that chapter about the mountains of the moon, it was because to sort of honor that idea that these mountains are what the early founders of Chinese culture apparently followed those mountains, always keeping the mountains right. And in the old days, there used to be a lot more water, and water, rivers coming down into the Tarim Basin today. So there's probably a very gradual migration from Persia, what we call Persia or Iran. For the Tower of Babel, when the Tower of Babel collapses and all these different groups head off in different directions. Basically the end of the Garden of Eden. And I think that's what King Mu was looking for. He's looking for the Garden of Eden and trying to go back to that land, that time when everybody was happy and they had enough fruit before knowledge, and there's a certain tribe, a group of tribes that followed these mountains all the way to China. And the origins of Chinese culture I think are based upon that thread.
I am quite curious. Have you ever met any hermits with any sort of a special ability?
Well, the hermits I met, like Yuan Zhao. Yeah, Yuan Zhao. She's on the cover of the English copy of Road to Heaven. She was a very powerful monk. She was a tantric teacher, and she became a hermit near the end of her life. Usually, the usual path is it's like graduate school. You become a hermit to get your PhD. Of course, you can't get a PhD without an undergraduate degree. So usually the hermit tradition in China is some people are attracted as they go on their spiritual path. They want to go farther. And those are most of the hermits in China are on that path, the graduate school path. I'd say 90% of all hermits in China don't spend more than 5 years in the mountains. It's usually about 3 to 5 years. They're there for a period of time. They're not there forever. They're not burning the bridge with the world. The Chinese hermit has never been that kind of person. The Chinese hermits have always been an important part of society. They've always been highly respected. And the hermits have always cared for people who make up the society. So people just go into the mountains for a period to gain a certain level of spiritual awareness, certain level of insight, and they give themselves their own PhD. Nobody gives you a PhD. You decide when it's time to go down. But if you read the biographies of hermits in China, you find almost no. First of all, you can't find a biography of any great Chinese master who was not a hermit. Every Chinese master you can read about, whether they're Taoist or they're Buddhist or even Confucian, they have always gone into the mountains to spend time alone. But not forever, but they go there for a while. Usually 3 to 5 years is typical. And then they come down. So the Chinese hermit is, again, never loses this association with the society that they're part of. And they're a major part of it. And so they're still like that today. You go into the mountains, not forever, but to gain a higher insight, to go a little further, see how far you can go. But eventually you come down because you want to help others. That's what it's all about.
Do you do daily Zen practice?
Oh, every day. I usually do it in the morning.
What do you do?
I meditate. I sit down. I have some cushions. I meditate usually for about 40 minutes or so. I don't have a timer. I don't burn incense, so I never know. I just whenever my legs begin to hurt, and usually it's after about 45 minutes. I just do meditation. Sometimes I use the meditation. I've often used meditation for solving translation problems when I'm doing Buddhist texts. I use the meditation like a koan. Like what is the, people can use a huatuo or a koan to meditate on. Well, what I do when I'm translating, I just use that phrase that I don't know what it means, how to translate it. I'll use it like a koan. So sometimes I use my meditation for translation issues, but otherwise I'm just meditating on my breath.
Thank you so much, Bill, for the interview. It was amazing chatting to you and hearing about your journey.
Well, it's just a journey. We're all on journeys. This happened to be mine, but it's one. I'm really glad I took this trip. And it's not over yet.